Welcome to Workshop Wednesday. Today, we're actually going beyond the basics. We always like to rotate topics through here, sometimes a little bit more for the beginners. This one is definitely for those of you who are just a little bit more advanced, have got some experience. We're going to be talking about tracking webinars, and in particular, WebinarJam and EverWebinar, which is one of the most popular webinar platforms that is out there. It's the one that we actually use as well here. So it hits definitely close to home, and it's one that many of our clients use as well. So we figured, hey, this would be a great one for you. My name is Chris Mercer. I'm the co-founder of measurementmarketing.io. And yes, I do go by Mercer. You can see our content on such platforms as Digital Marketer, Conversion Excel, Social Media Examiner, Seriously Simple Marketing, and others around the web. As with all of these workshops, one new idea is all you're trying to get, especially when it comes to something like this one, because there's a lot of moving pieces. So if it doesn't make sense all at one time, that's okay. Grab the one thing that does, put that into practice, then you come back, rewatch this, and you will gain something else from it. So without further ado, beyond the basics, tracking webinars with WebinarJam and EverWebinar in particular. And guess what we're doing today for this workshop? We have a special guest instructor, and easy for me to say, a special guest instructor. His name is Ahmad Kanani. He's the founder of CFAC.com. He is actually one of our certified measurement marketers, one of our originals, actually, back from 2017. So you know he knows his stuff. He is a platform expert on the following platforms: Shopify. We go to him with all of our Shopify questions. WooCommerce, WordPress. Has got some incredible technical skills, which he's going to be showing you here. You're going to see exactly what I'm talking about. And if you need to contact him, which you probably will want to after you see what he can do, hello@cfvac.com. And of course, just over at cfvac.com is his website. Ahmad, how are you doing today, sir?
Hello, I'm doing awesome.
Outstanding.
Great.
Outstanding. Perfect. Glad you are here, and really looking forward. I mean, Ahmad and I go back years at this point. We're on weekly calls just about every single week for the last couple of years. So it's been awesome to sort of get to know him, and as he's been growing his business since being certified, and he's in there sort of always pushing the limits as to, kind of like what we are too. And we have talked about this problem with, in particular with webinars and iframe tracking, and then how WebinarJam and EverWebinar actually make things even more difficult than that traditional iframe tracking. So it's a great example to be able to play with. I'm super excited that you are here. Now, the 5 pillars of measurement marketing, we always like to bring all of these workshops to these 5. Remember, there's the plan, the build, the report, the forecast, and optimizing. So when it comes to how does this workshop relate to those, you're going to see it relates to all of them, because you need to be able to plan out your cross-domain tracking so that your traffic attribution remains intact. So if a webinar is being, you got a registration from a webinar and it was from Facebook, you want to know that. And that's why we're going to be setting this stuff up. The build, you're actually going to be seeing exactly how to build this using Tag Manager. And of course, there's the reporting, where you can actually go through and track the number of people who actually are being registered by the various tracking sources, and maybe even what have been sales that are being created by those traffic sources. Once you have those, you can then begin to forecast out what your future webinar should look like. And then ultimately, when you have those forecasts, you send through your real traffic, and that will allow you to optimize, because you're going to see where you're hitting the mark and where you are not. All right, let's get underway. I'm going to explain the problem, and then we're going to bring in Ahmad to sort of help us out. So I think the best way to explain the problem is to sort of visualize what's going on here. So with WebinarJam in particular, what happens is I load up our page, and we're just going to make this a registration page, and I'll show you an example of this in just a moment. But we've got a registration page loading up, and those of you who use these platforms are familiar with this. You can grab the button and you post the little button on your page, and you've got the analytics loading up on your site. Okay, so you've got client numbers, and this is kind of our little client cookie tag from Google Analytics. So we've got the button that pops up. Well, as soon as we click on that button, this is what's interesting. Then you see the form. It looks like this that pops up. Well, this is an iframe. So this is an iframe. And the very first thing we need to do is get visibility into this iframe. Now, again, what's unique about this is the way that WebinarJam and EverWebinar works is if the iframe just loaded up on this page, kind of in the background, when this page loads, and if the iframe is already there, it's a whole different setup. It's a traditional sort of iframe cross-domain tracking. We've got webinars already back there, workshops already back there for you on that. But in this case, you click the button, then an iframe, which was not previously there, loads. And that's what makes this one particularly challenging. So the very first thing we need to do is we need to get visibility onto this form, because what happens immediately, and I'm going to flip into our little example here, what happens, I'm going to go to my little awesome webinar page. I've got Tag Manager pulled up. I've got it in preview so we can see what's going on. So if I go to my awesome webinar page and then I click on the register now button to actually register, I can see that I've got my form pulled up. But what I see in Google Analytics is that I went to my awesome webinar page, but I don't see the form at all. I don't actually have visibility into that at all. So the very first thing I want to do is set that up. And I'm going to do that real quick by just going into here. We're going to copy and paste our codes. So we're going to grab this and I'm going to go into our webinar. Now this is the WebinarJam setup, so it's not a tutorial on how to use this, but I want you to be familiar with this particular part of it. So I'm just going to flip through, go into integrations, because integrations is where we're going to want to do this. Third-party tracking system, and right in here, you have your spots. So there's registration page, registration form. That's what actually we're looking at. What I do is I put it everywhere. So I'm just going to grab both of them. So we're going to do that, and we're just going to copy and paste the scripts. They both are going to show up there. And then I'm going to do the same thing here and here and here and here. So we've got just everything posted on all of the different stages. So in EverWebinar now, our tag manager code will be registration page. It'll be on the registration form. It'll be on the post-registration thank you page. It'll be on the live room. It'll be on the replay room, which is super important. So this should give us visibility, right? Kind of like our step one. So I'm going to go ahead and click on confirm. Now that's all saved in there. Kind of next it over till I get to the final finish. Okay, so now we've got our main dashboard, our main webinar set up. Let's test it and find out. So I'm just going to come through here. We're going to refresh our pages. Okay, so now what should I see here? Remember, we're going to trust but verify. So when I click on this register now button, what I should see is a preview mode pop up, because if the tag manager code is now on there and I've got preview turned on, which I do, because you can know this because of the orange bar, right? So I've got all that. So I should see that this pops up. So we're going to come into the register now, and what we're going to do here, I'm going to do one other quick thing. So I'm going to click on our variables. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want to just verify what this preview window is actually looking at. So I'm looking at page path, page URL. I can see it's looking at the demo site, right? So I've got my awesome webinar page. That's the one that's currently recorded. So this preview window is looking at this page right now. So I'm going to click on register now. And then we've got our iframe that just popped up. So this is at this point now we're on Gendy's site, right? So we've got them. So now I've got Gendy's popped up. And I'm still looking at this particular page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to minimize our little preview window here. So I'm going to do this and watch what happens. So I'm going to click and minimize and just keep your eyes kind of on this area. So if I minimize that, what is sitting right behind one preview window is another preview window. And that is a little difficult. So you've got to be aware that even though it might not look like it's there, it might be there. And this trick that I'm showing you here, it gives you the ability to really verify, kind of trust but verify, which one am I looking at. So now I just flipped into our page view. I'm looking at our variables and I'm saying, okay, what is this one looking at? And you can see page URL events.gendy.com. So it's looking at the actual register box in this case, our little event. So what should that mean for analytics? Again, trust but verify, right? What should happen is that it goes in analytics, but we want to make sure that it's not. We want to trust that we set up correctly, but we're verifying that it's screwed up somewhere. So if we come into our analytics, we can see that it is in fact there. So there's my awesome webinar and there's my registration pop-up box. So, okay, trust but verified. It looks like things are working the way we expect them to. Okay, so now we've got our 2 pages lighting up in Google Analytics. That's the first battle, right? First thing is get visibility. We've got at least visibility. But here's what's currently happening. So if I go back into our idea here of we brought it to this form. Now I can see this, right? So now I've got visibility. But what happens is when this pops up, I get a completely different client ID, right? Because we have not done any sort of cross-domain tracking with this one at all. And so I've got client ABC, then client XYZ. So we've got a completely different client ID, right? This is a cross-domain problem right now that we have. So as we come through here, oops, can't even get this to do this. There we go. So we've got client ID ABC on this page. This iframe pops up, and now it's a completely different client ID. And so our challenge is you would think, oh, I'm just going to go ahead and set up cross-domain tracking the way you're normally used to. You put it in Tag Manager and you put the different domains and they all go together. But the problem is you have to link them. And this is where iframes kind of create an issue just on their own because it's tough to do the linking back and forth. But in this case, this iframe isn't even there. Remember, technically, all of this isn't even there until you push the button. Then these show up. So we've got to figure out a way to basically have Tag Manager help us out and say, okay, what happens is when this page loads up, I need this to not happen. Or if it does happen, what I needed to do is go back and then grab another version of this client ID and override it so that these two match. Because when these two client IDs match, that's cross-domain tracking, right? That's how we know that everything's being continuously tracked under the same original traffic source that brought them to this main page. So with that, I will bring in Ahmad here. And Ahmad, kind of walk us through, like, first, did I sort of explain that properly in terms of what the challenge is? And then what are the next steps to being able to solve this? Now that we got visibility, how do we connect the dots?
Yes, absolutely. So now that we have visibility on this, if we go to Google Analytics real time, we should see two users. And that is because we've had two client IDs. So two active users on site, you can see it's up there right now, two active users. While it is just the same browser. You've had the measurement marketing IO, and then you've opened the
so for example, if I go back to the demo account, the homepage, this user, you're going to see switch. This bottom user, you're going to see switch over because it's being associated to the same user. But this Gendy one, we wouldn't see that. Okay, so there we go. We just saw that one switch, but this one's not because, again, Google Analytics thinks it's a different user.
Yeah. And the actual problem with this is, as you mentioned, the pop-up is being loaded dynamically. So it is not on the page at the beginning. So you cannot use the classic way of using allow linker and decorating the link. And by decorating the link, I mean the classic way of doing cross-domain, in which Google Analytics adds a query parameter to the URL of the iframe to pass the client ID to the iframe. And it's a bit technical, but basically we cannot do that because iframe is not on the page at the time it loads.
So basically we can't set up cross-domain tracking because there is nothing to cross-domain track yet. Everything's
at page load, yes.
At this page, it's just this. Then when we click this button, now there's the cross-domain iframe that we got to deal with, and only at this point. So we have to basically tell Tag Manager, which tries to set up all the cross-domain when the page loads, but it can't because there's nothing to cross-domain. Then we have to say, hey, Tag Manager, there's been a change. There's an iframe now set up cross-domain tracking. And that's what makes this particularly an interesting challenge.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the solution for this, if I want to tell it like a story, is that we need to set up something that does this that I'm going to explain. First, the page loads, your website, the mysite.com loads, and it starts listening. And by listening, I mean, it is monitoring and waiting for some clue, for some message from the iframe to know that when the iframe loads, because otherwise the loading of the iframe is not visible to the page. So we need to do this. Page loads, and it starts monitoring or listening, okay, for the iframe.
So I'm going to put this little directions down here.
Yeah, listen for the iframe at the time of page load. But next, what happens, we click on the register button and the iframe pops up, okay? At this time, we know that the parent page, I'm going to call the mysite.com the parent of the iframe. We know that the parent page is ready and is listening for something. So what we can do is that we can set up a tag or a script inside the iframe that goes and tells the parent that now I'm loaded. I'm loaded and I'm waiting for you to give me the client ID.
Okay, so at this point, it would have no client ID.
No client ID.
And then we would put something on the iframe itself.
Exactly.
That says, like, you know, I'm loaded.
I'm ready.
I'm ready. Yeah, I'm ready.
And we also need to make the iframe listen, because iframe needs to listen for the parent to give it the client ID.
Okay, so then it listens. And this is for the CID, the client ID.
Client ID, yeah. At this point, when the parent gets the message from the iframe that it's ready and is listening for the client ID, what it does is that it goes to the Google Analytics cookie, grabs the client ID, the ABC client ID, which identifies the user, and posts it to the iframe. And by that time, the iframe is listening. So it's ready to grab the client ID from the parent page and use it for itself to fire the Google Analytics hit.
Okay, so walk us through that again. So this iframe loads up and says, I'm ready. So this sort of connects the dot to this listener, right? Which then does what? So the listener then grabs the client ID?
Grabs the client ID.
Okay, so now the listener, now we're on the parent page, the listener from the parent page grabs the client ID, copies it, and essentially sends it here.
Yes.
Right? So now they've got client ID ABC. And then once that happens, because of this little listener section we have here on the iframe, then the client ID goes, okay, now that I'm here, it now listens for the client ID.
Exactly.
Okay.
And at this point, the iframe is ready to fire the Google Analytics page view. So we need to delay the Google Analytics page view of the iframe and wait for the client ID to arrive before we send that. Otherwise, iframe loads already sends the Google Analytics page view, and when the client ID arrives, it's already too late.
Yep, that makes total sense. Okay, so I'm just going to come down here. We're going to walk through everything. I'm going to try to plan this out a little bit better. So this is going to be our GA page view tag. That'll fire. And let's make a couple of these. So we'll kind of make it Google Analytics orange. All right. So we have our page view tag here, and we have our page view tag here on the iframe itself. So in fact, what I'll do is I'm going to make all of these, everything that's iframe oriented, we'll make them kind of these blue. So everything's blue in the iframes. Okay. So what's happening is the iframe is going to load. There's going to be a signal on the iframe that says, I'm ready. That is being sent to the parent page, which is listening for it because there's a script there that's listening for I'm ready as a signal. When that signal happens, and this is independent of the page view is already loaded at this particular point. When the signal happens, it's going to grab the client ID on the parent page. It's going to send it to the iframe. So now they've got the same client IDs at this point, different places, but same IDs. Then that triggers this listener, which is listening another script that's on the iframe. It's listening for a client ID. And it's that script that triggers the page view for the iframe. And then when that page view fires, that page view is using this client ID, which this page view is using this client ID. They're both identical client IDs, and that's why cross-domain tracking will work.
Exactly.
Okay, perfect. So with that being the case, then let's go ahead and build this out script-wise. I think we kind of have the story down. So what's this look like in real world? So I want to flip into Tag Manager at this point.
Okay.
Okay, so we're in Tag Manager. And we'll want to start with tag.
Yes. Is it empty, the Tag Manager?
It's the demo account.
It's a demo account. Okay.
Yeah.
So the first thing that we need to do is to separate the page view tag of the parent with the page view tag of the pop-up, because we want to delay the page view for the pop-up, but we don't want to do the same with the parent's page view.
Okay. So right now I've got my page view tag with all pages.
All pages.
And so I want to edit that so that it does only certain pages, right?
Only certain pages.
Okay.
And this should be the page view tag for the parent.
So we're going to say this is, in our case, it'll be all the measurementmarketing.io pages.
Exactly.
That I could say. So I'm now going to change my trigger and say when the page URL contains, and we'll say measurementmarketing.io, because that's what all of our demo site has. So when that page, and again, you can do this different ways, host name or whatever. I'm just going to use page URL, keep it simple. So when the page URL contains measurementmarketing.io, and I'm going to say slash because there's always going to be that, then I will save this, and this is going to be page view. And in this case, it's going to be all mm.io pages. Okay, so now I've got this on all pages. And then what so I'm going to subtract this out. This is gone now. So now this will only trigger on mm.io pages, and that's it. So now I'm going to rename this and say page view, and this is mm.io pages. Okay, so now I've got one trigger set up, and then I want to do another one, I assume, for the Gendi stuff.
Yes.
You want to come back. Okay, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to copy this out. So now this one's copied. So I'm going to take this, and this is going to be GA. We're going to say this is Gendi. Now, again, why am I calling it Gendi? Because if we go back and we look at what this showed up as, it was Gendi.com. So that's why I'm doing it, Gendi.com with 2 N's. So that's why I could call it WebinarJam or whatever else, whatever is useful for me. But I'm going to keep it Gendi because that's kind of what I know. So it's all Gendi.com pages. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here. We're going to take this trigger. I'm just going to copy this. And we're going to say this is page view. In this case, it's all.
Okay, so now there's a trick.
Yep.
It shouldn't be all Gendi.com pages.
All right, good to know.
We only want to delay it on the pop-up, and not, for example, for the webinar live page or webinar thank you page, which are normal pages.
So in this case, what we say register box would be our key that sort of separates us out.
Gendi.com/register box.
And that makes sense because you're only wanting this to happen on the iframe, not necessarily on replay pages, live pages, everything else. Gotcha.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
so Gendi.com/register box will get us there. So it'll be Gendi.com. It'll be Gendi register box. So here I'm going to change this. So now when it contains Gendi.com/register box, and that should
was the
match.
big capital? I mean, I don't know if it makes any difference, but no.
Yeah, I always assume case sensitive, but in this case it's not, so it's good.
Yeah, it's
so
not.
that should work either way. So we'll go ahead and save that. So now I've got the page view. We're going to subtract this out and add in the new one I just did. So now I've got this one for Gendi.com register box, technically now. So for register box pages, then this one is the trigger for that. So we'll save that. Now I've got my 2 Google Analytics page view tags back to back. And if I refresh this, I can see my triggers are there too. All right, so there's my one page view for all the traditional pages. Here's my other one for the Gendi.register box. And I've got the 2 signals as far as when analytics is going to run. What's the next step?
Okay, the next step is that we actually did another simple mistake here, because we are firing the GA page view of the register box at the page view event, while we actually need to delay it. Okay, we shouldn't trigger as soon as the pop-up loads. This setup that we have it right now is going to fire the page view at the moment the pop-up loads. Yep. And we know that at that moment, we don't have the client ID.
So we have to wait for the client ID to come in. Okay, so we want to almost trigger this off of something, because we have to do it from the script. It makes me think that that's going to be some sort of like custom event.
Yes.
Okay. So then let's take out for now. So I'm just going to create just get rid of the trigger entirely, because actually we don't need that. So we'll save it without a trigger for now, and we're going to come back to this. So now we've got our page view for the page view tag, just nothing firing it yet. And I've got my page view here. So from the perspective of page views, I've kind of got this one covered. So I'm going to say this is green. We're going to mark these as green as done. So this one's working. We know this one's working. This one's in progress, not quite ready yet. Okay, so now we've got, just to really quickly recap, we've got our page view that we've adjusted so it fires just on, in our case, the measurement.marketing.io pages. And we've got another page view that's been created to fire on a future event, but we don't have that event yet. So we're going to hold off for now. This is just going to light up our Gendi.com pages. So now what we need to do is, I guess, to grab the client ID at this point, right, Ahmad? We want to be able to grab the client ID, because that's really what we need to be able to pass. That's an important thing. And we're going to do that. How? Is that going to be with like a script or a custom JavaScript variable?
Yeah, we need to store it in a variable. And for that, we are going to need a custom JavaScript variable that goes and reads it from the cookie and stores it in itself.
Okay, now Ahmad has given me the script already, so I'm just going to copy and paste this in. One quick note is you will need to customize it with your tracking ID. So you're not going to use your gas variable here because it's not made for that. It's made for the actual tracking ID. So like, you would put in UA12345, whatever your thing is. Now in my case, I have that already set up with a constant variable. So that's what I'm going to do. So I've got a constant variable that already has our tracking ID in there. So that's what I'm going to input there. But that's what that's for. So not your gas variable, but you would put your actual tracking ID. And then Ahmad, sort of walk us through generally how this is working.
Okay, so it starts by getting all the Google Analytics trackers on the page, because at some website you might have more than one GA script on one page. And in the at line 5, it's going to loop through all those trackers and find which one of them is corresponding to our own Google Analytics property with this line. Yes.
Okay, and that's why we want the property ID in there, not our gas variable, the actual tracking ID. So it's saying,
yes.
Hey, is it for this tracking ID? Yes. If it's for this tracking ID, no. And if it says yes, then it's going to return
client ID
with the client ID. Perfect. And this, we should say, is also heavily inspired by Simo Ahava code that we found over there. He's done lots of cool things to customize Tag Manager. And so we had taken a little bit of this as inspiration that what this does is just this one thing. It grabs the client ID. And again, just to sort of restate, it's looking for all the trackers. It grabs all the trackers on the page. It flips through them one at a time, matches for the one that you're currently looking for, which in this case is for measurementmarketing.io. Then once it has that, it returns with the client ID.
Exactly.
All right, perfect. So we're going to save this. We're going to say it's custom JavaScript. In this case, it's returning with client ID. All right. So now that we have that, what is our next step? So at this point, just kind of going back to our chart here. So we have the page view done. Now we've basically grabbed this. So we know what this is at this point. So what's next?
The next thing is that let's create the listeners on the parent page and on the iframe.
Okay, so we're going to have one listener here for the iframe. When the iframe is ready, then we're going to put a listener on the iframe that says, oh, I have the client ID. I've been updated. The client ID is correct, basically. Okay, yeah. So we're going to do those two listeners. And at that point, are we doing that with a tag, like a custom HTML tag?
Yeah.
Because they're going to be scripts.
So
okay,
for each of those listeners, we will create one custom HTML tag and we will put some JavaScript code in there, which runs as soon as the page loads. So when the page loads, the code runs and it starts listening. It doesn't do anything, but it starts listening, and we will have the code, the necessary code in there to be able to grab the information that is listening for and push it into the data layer.
Okay, perfect.
Which is what we need.
So in this case, there is no, now again, you've copy pasted these scripts, and I'm going to have all of these listed for everybody to have access to them. But the script itself, there's no customization needed on this script. It's pretty much just copy and paste.
Yes.
Is that right? Okay, perfect. All right, so walk us through kind of what's happening here. So this is the one that would be loaded on the parent page.
Yes.
And so what's this doing?
It starts, by adding the window event message and creating a function at the window, which is, again, creating the data layer, creating the data variable for the message.
If the data layer is already there, does that create a new one? Does it override it?
No, we have those two parallel lines here that says or. So either it creates the data layer, or if it's there, if it uses the data layer that is actually there.
Perfect. Okay, so we're not overriding the data layers, just checking to make sure there's one there. If not, it creates one.
And then on line 7, if the data that it receives from the iframe contains an event, okay, so this is the way it checks that it's receiving correct data. The data that is going to be received should have an event inside it. It pushes something to the data layer, which is the event from the received data.
Okay, so this is our variable that would just input the value here.
Yes.
Key pair. Okay.
And the actual data from the received data, which is basically, you will see later, would be the actual client ID.
Okay, perfect. So this is basically the listener part where it's just saying, hey, if this happens, if not, then what?
That was actually the action part. So this is the action part, which when listened and found something, when listened to something,
Got it. When
does
it
that.
actually hears something, right?
Yes,
When that listener hears something, then this is the action it takes, and then this
pushes
is
into the data layer. And this
right.
function, which I hope I don't need to explain
No,
because we
just
don't need to change it all,
yeah, we don't.
It
We
does-
just generally walk us through kind of what's going on. We don't need to get into specifics, but basically, it's listening, right? This is the thing where it's just sort of
it is
adds the event
creating an
listener.
event listener
Yep.
and is getting the data from wherever it hears the data from, which is the iframe in this case, and then it will tell it to the parent to just do the action that we've defined.
Okay, so this is our actual listener. When it hears something, then it says go up here and take this action.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so then when do we want to fire?
I haven't wrote that part of the code. I guess I grabbed it from Stack Overflow.
Oh, great.
Some,
Yeah. And this does, it goes to show,
remember
like if you've got the
things a year
technical
ago.
skills, you don't have to write everything.
No.
Yeah. So that makes sense. This is just
I could
a
never
Stack
write this from
Overflow.
scratch.
I
I
hear ya.
just, whenever you or whoever is gonna, watch this, whenever you want to do something and you just not know how to do it, you can just search for it. That's what I did like about a year ago. I wanted the event listener on the page to listen from the events from an iframe. And I did some Google search, and usually I find it on Stack Overflow or other technical websites. And I just read the code, try it out, and figure out how to get it to work.
Okay, so we're going to say this is a script. We're going to do parent, and this is the listener for the parent. And then in this particular one, we're going to fire it on not all pages, because we don't want it firing on every single page. We only want it firing on the mm.io pages, because by definition, in this case, they're all the parent pages. So then we'll go ahead and save that. I have that correct, Ahmad? So just firing it
Yes.
only on parent, because it's a parent listener, so it's only for parent pages. Perfect. Okay,
Yeah.
so then we're going to create our listener, again, custom HTML, because it's a script. We're going to create a listener for the iframe page. So I just copied and pasted in what we have there. And this page also needs, this script needs also no customization from what I can tell. It doesn't look at any variables or anything in there.
No,
so Ahmad,
it is
kind of
ready.
walk us through. Yeah, what's this one doing? So this looks vaguely similar, right? Like this is the listener, and then this is the action it needs to take. Okay, so what's different about this one?
The first part is actually completely the same. So up to line, I guess, 28 or something, 29, it is the same code that we used for the listener on the parent page. But the difference is that when the iframe loads and it starts listening, it's time for it to let the parents know. At this point, we know that the parents is already listening, so it's okay to send something to the parent. And we know that the iframe is loaded, and iframe is also listening for anything that comes to it, like a client ID. So it's a good time to let the parent know. And if
That
you see the line 34,
Yep.
it is sending an object to the parent with the event that says iframe needs client ID.
Gotcha. Okay. So it's going to send an event now to the parent. And we know the parent's listening because that happened when GTM first loads on the parent before this register button even gets popped. So we already know the listener's there by default. So it's already first. So we know the parent's listening. Then we pop, the iframe opens up. iframe starts listening just like the parent is in this case for all this, but then sends something to the parent through this post object, through to the parent that says, okay, well, now that I've loaded, I need the client ID. And that's the signal through an event, which is going to trigger the listener. All right, I'm with you. So now do we just fire this essentially on anything that's the register box page?
Yes, it is on the page view of the register box.
Perfect.
So as
we're using
soon
our
as the
same
register
trigger.
box loads, we fire this. So I'm gonna walk you through the event. Someone clicks on the button, the pop-up, the register box loads. Okay, it starts the listener, and it lets the parents know that it needs a client ID. So this is the order of things that are happening here.
Okay. So here so far, we're going to bring back to our Lucid chart. So right now we did our regular everyday page view, which is for the mm.io pages. We had our custom JavaScript cookie that was pulling the client ID. We just set up a listener that was kind of the generic listener listening for stuff on the parent. Then we just set up a basically this one, right? So it's kind of a listener and I'm ready at the same time. It's doing both. Is that right?
Yes.
So it's basically the listener part was the same, exactly the same as the other listener. With the difference is that it has this component added to it, which is the I'm ready. And really what we're saying is, instead of I'm ready, it's saying, need client ID, right?
Yes.
Like that's what it's really doing here is like, hey, not only am I ready, but I need the client ID, bud. And that should trigger this, which should then send this. So now that we've kind of doing this, like how do we connect the dots? So now we've got these things set up. So now when need client ID comes through, the listener's going to listen for that. And then how do we send that client ID to the iframe? I assume we already have the client iframe because that's the custom JavaScript variable, but how do we actually send that value to the iframe itself?
Okay, so we need two more components on the parents page. One of them is a trigger. So the trigger is a custom event. Remember what events did we send from the iframe to the parent? iframe needs client ID.
Right. So let me get back there real quick just to make sure everybody else is in play too. So we've got our script. This is the part that we said already, and we're doing this. iframe, this is the event that we sent over. I'm case sensitive, so we're just copying this out. So this is the event. If this said Bugs Bunny, we would just copy Bugs Bunny. But in this case, iframe needs client ID is what we're saying there. Then we could trigger, and we're going to do a custom event trigger that will fire whenever that custom event comes across. Perfect. So now this will fire on all custom events because the only times it should happen is when the iframe really needs a client ID. That's the only time this specific event will come through. Okay, so now this is a custom event, and then paste that in. Perfect. So there's our trigger. And then what's the next component we need to set up?
On this trigger, the parent should send the client ID that it already has because we've created a variable for it. It should send the client ID that it already has to the iframe. So we need another which does this and which is triggered on that event, on the iframe needs client ID.
So because this is something we want Google Tag Manager to do, like here's what I want you to do. That's why it's a tag. So we're going to do a new tag, and this will be a custom HTML. And this is going to actually now send the client ID to the iframe itself. So this is entering in a little more JavaScript. And in this case, we have another variable that's already in here, but this variable is actually what we already set up earlier. This is the first variable we set up, the custom JavaScript that grabs the client IDs. That was the thing that sort of kicked it all off. So there's our variable. That's where it comes back into play. Is okay. So what this is saying then, you want to walk us through kind of the overall?
Okay. So it is first defining the frame window and says the frame window is the iframe which has a source of events.gently.com because it should know where to send the data to. We know that the iframe is listening, okay? But when we send data, we should tell Google Tag Manager or the window where to send this data. That's why on line 3, we are defining the frame window. Yep. And then through line 4 to 7, we are defining what is going to be said or posted as a message to the iframe, which is, again, a piece of JSON. It has an event, received client ID, because when it goes there, when it goes and reaches the iframe, what happens? iframe has received the client ID.
And then it pushes that into the data layer.
Mm-hmm. And the data is the client ID, which is going to, on line 6, it is being read from the variable and is being sent as part of the message. And on line 8, we are actually posting the message, which is the post object to the events.gently.com.
Perfect. Okay. So now we said in order to trigger this, so when do we basically want to send the information to the iframe? It's when the iframe says, hey, I'm ready for the information. And so that trigger is our custom event, iframe needs client ID, that we just created.
Exactly.
All right, perfect. So now So it's another script. This is send parent to send client ID to iframe. All right. Okay, so real quick recap. At this point, I've got the parent listener rocking out. It's listening for its thing. It's listening in this case for, hey, I'm ready for the client ID. I've got the listener on Jenny.com that's doing its thing, and it's listening for like, here's the client ID. But it also simultaneously sort of, when it loads up, it sends, hey, I need the client ID to the parent. When the parent hears that, here's the script that says, cool, send this client ID to the iframe. And so then it's going to send the client ID to the iframe where that listener is listening for it. And when that happens, it's getting the event, in this case, of received client ID, right? So it's getting this piece right here. And my guess is this is a pretty key component based on how we've seen this already go out. So Ahmad, is it as simple as, okay, well then once you see received client ID come through, go ahead and fire the page view?
Yes, but almost. So we need two components. First, the trigger, and second, the actual client ID. So we need to trigger this on that event, but we first need to create a place for the client ID. So let's go and create a data layer variable for it.
Okay. And that's because when the listener from the parent, or actually when that script, I should say, from the parent sends to the iframe, that's what it's doing. It listens for the details and then it pushes them into the data layer.
Exactly. It pushes into the data layer, which creates an event and a value.
Perfect.
We have the event as a trigger, and we need to have the value as well.
So is it as simple as this? Or, oh no, we're grabbing the client ID, right? Because the client ID is what's been passed through.
I guess the I was like capital. Yep. It should be it. Let's go back and double check, but it should be correct.
Okay. I'm going to name this as if we did do this correct. We'll come back if it's not. So data layer value client, little camel case with the client ID. And then if we go back to our script where we're pulling this from, right? So in our script, we sent through client ID camel case. So we're saying because this is going to be in the data layer and actually have the value of our client ID from our JavaScript variable, that's why our data layer variable is grabbing this. And this is the value that we're actually going to send through to Google Analytics from the iframe side of things.
Correct.
Perfect. And it's because this is being grabbed from the parent. Okay, starting to make some sense. So now, if I go back into our page view, so I go into our page view, I'm going to set up the trigger, which is basically when it says iframe or when it says I'm ready, right? So when we have a custom event and it says received iframe, I think it was. I should just go back.
Received client ID.
Yeah.
With capital C and capital I.
I'm loving copy and paste just to be sure that I TBB it all. So it's when the event happens. So when the event happens, we're going to tell it, go ahead and fire the page view. Again, this is on the iframe side of things now. So then the iframe should fire, we're going to do a custom event, when it sees this, which is the parent basically saying, hey, here's your ID. You now have it. So then it's going to fire our page view tag. But if we just do this, it's going to fire still with the wrong client ID. So we need to override the settings just for this one tag. We're going to override the settings and say, don't use the ID that you're going to set naturally as a cookie because that's the wrong one. We're going to override it. We're essentially kind of forcing the linker thing. That's what the linker really does anyways, is override. We're kind of forcing that. And we're going to do that by saying in the fields to set where the client ID is, I want you to use this client ID instead. And what we're going to do is we're going to use our data layer variable that we just created, because the data layer variable is going to pull out the value of client ID, which is the original custom JavaScript variable that the parent sent over. And that should close our loop. Is that right? Did I sort of state that right, Ahmad?
Yes, absolutely.
Perfect. So then when the page view fires, it'll fire with the correct parent client ID. All right. So now we save that. And then is it time to sort of trust but verify? And we'll kind of go through and see if this worked the way we think it should.
Yes, let's go.
All right, let's do it. Now, what we should see, what we're hoping we're going to see, is instead of two users in the beginning, we would just see one user as I go through page to page to page. Because that would be that, it's tracking the user ID across. Sometimes this works in real time, sometimes it doesn't. But let's do that. There's other ways to check, including checking for the client ID itself, but we'll do that We'll do both here. So now I'm going to refresh, make sure we're on the right container. I am going to refresh, make sure we're on the right container on this side as well. All right. So now I've got my preview pulled up. And let's see first, I just want to verify that I'm seeing some of my new variables here to make sure I'm looking at the right thing. There's our client ID. So far at page view it was false. It didn't have it yet. That's when analytics actually fired. By DOM ready, it's false. By window loaded, that's where we have our client ID. So at this point, it's got value for client ID, which is great because we haven't even popped the iframe yet. So now when I come into here, remember we've got two of these, the way the preview works here is we're going to click on register now. There's our iframe that pops up. So now that the iframe's popped up, I'm still looking at the old one. How do I know that? Because I can go in here and look in page URL to see kind of what it's recurring. There we go. So it's looking at measurement marketing demo page. But if I subtract this out, now what I want to really look at is our client ID stuff. So there's our client ID. It ends in 394. So if I minimize this one, I immediately see the other one behind it, which is this is for the actual iframe. Again, how do we know that? Trust but verify. I go to page view, I look at variables, and I can see at the page view, these are the pages that it's looking at. So it's looking at the Gendy page. So now, if I come back up here, so let's go to window loaded as well. Actually, when did that fire? That fired, I don't see the events firing, but, which means I probably won't see our variables either, right? So we see a little breakdown. So there's false, which would make sense. And our data layer variable also would be undefined because it didn't pass through.
Okay, I noticed that. Let's go back to the page URL down on this one, on this preview window.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So let's do that. So we'll go to page URL. So this is on our preview. This
Page
is our
URL. Do you see that register box, the B is capital?
Yes, case sensitive to the rescue. I love that. This is why we TBV things, right? Because it's like, oh, this didn't quite work the way we wanted it to. So I've got to look at my triggers. And in this case, I got to match exactly what's going on. Normally it's like simple stuff like this. So it's page view. We said all Gendy register box, and I said register box with little, but we don't want register box with a little b. We want register box with a capital B. Okay, so gendy.com/register box to make sure that's going to work. So gendy.com/register box. So when the page URL, capital B. Awesome, fine. So now we're going to save this. Okay, we're going to do one more refresh, and then we're going to refresh again. Okay, so we already knew the parent page stuff worked. So now I'm going to go into the register now, click on the iframe. Now I'm starting to see some cool things. All right, so here, look what happened here. Now remember, we're still looking at, if I go back to variables, I'm going to look at this event, iframe needs client ID. This was the thing that came back from the iframe to the parent. How do I know I'm on the parent? Because again, I can go to page URL, see I'm on the parent page. And I know that I got what I needed because this is iframe needs client ID. Great. So what should have happened is when this happened, we should see a tag fire that basically sends the form to the client, to the iframe, which it did. Parent to send client. So as soon as this happened, it sent the information to the iframe. So at that point, I'm kind of done with this preview. I'm going to minus this out. And again, we're going to change this. In fact, I'm going to flip the variable so it's super apparent. So now I'm going to minimize this. When I do this, there's going to be another preview window right behind this one. That is for this iframe. So minimize. There's our other one. So I'm going to pull this up. So now what I have is I've got received client ID that showed up. So when received client ID showed up, that's when it fired the page view tag. So at received client ID, what I want to verify now, kind of just to verify, is did it fire with the right information? So we already knew what the client ID was. So if I go back here, the data layer variable, client ID was undefined at this point in time. So what's happening now is we're firing everything, but it didn't fire with the right information because it overrode it with undefined, which should give us 2 users back here, which it does. Mm-hmm. So far we're close. We're making progress, and we're starting to see these messages come back and forth, but we're not getting the client ID defined, and that's because it's not being defined at all, which means it's not being pushed, would be my guess. So, or if it was being pushed, it doesn't have the information that it needed when it got pushed. So let's do this. Let's pull up, see if I can get one of these to load up again. So this is, let's go to our page view to make sure. This is the parent page. Perfect. So here's our parent page. So when, let's see, no, I take that back. It's not. This is our Gendy page. Problem is, I don't know if I can get back to our parent page. I don't think I can. Let's try over here.
No, I think
nope.
we cannot.
That's all right. We're just going to refresh it.
You have to refresh.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're going to refresh and we're going to see at what happened. So now I've got my information. If I click into this most recent event, go to variables, I can see my client ID does in fact have my client ID ending at 394. So that part was great. But when I click into register now, there's iframe needs client ID. So at this point, number event 13, that's when it's really important that GTM has what it needs. Client ID was there and the tag that was fired, send parent ID, came through and we can see the client ID is in there. So we see all of that and we should see an event received client ID and then there's the push that was in there. So something, let's minimize this. Now we're going to go to the parent, or sorry, we're on the parent. We're going to go to the iframe now when I minimize. So I minimize, there's our iframe. So now I go through here and received client ID does show. Now what this tells me is there was an event recorded, which means it had to be pushed to the data layer, right? So if I go to the data layer,
Yes.
I can see there's my event with my push. I know it happened because it even shows in this list. Then where was the client ID? Now I can already see where this went wrong. So what happened is when we set up the data layer, I set up the data layer variable to pull out this ID, not from here. It's in post message data. So what we're going to need is because this is kind of nested, right? It's kind of buried in it's an array, I guess is the best way the most accurate way of saying that, right, Ahmad? So this is, just like with e-commerce, when you've had to do this with data layers, those of you who watched this before, it's the same thing. So it's the client ID wasn't where I expected it to be, right? So it wasn't where I expected it to be. So everything's going well. It has the details in the data layer, but when I set up the data layer variable, so I'm gonna go back to our variables, go down here in DLV, client ID, I said, go look for the client ID, but it's not there, right? That's why it's returning undefined. So instead, I need to say, go to post message data, camel case, so post message data, then go into client ID and pull out that value. And that should solve our problem. So we're gonna go into here. So we're gonna do post message data. So post message data, camel case. Then I do a dot, which is kind of like our key to get through the squirrely braces. And we're gonna say client ID. Again, all case sensitive should work. So now we save that. Now we're gonna go ahead and preview, or refresh our preview, I should say. Now we should have a value that's actually coming through the data layer, because that seems to be where the breakdown is. So we have this, we knew this was working. We're gonna do that. I'm gonna minimize our parent right away because we don't need it. I'm gonna come back into here. I'm gonna see our received client ID. At this point, I'm gonna check the data layer. There's our data layer, it has the details in there. What did our variables do at this point? So data layer variable, bam, look at that. And then when this happened, because this was already having this value, the tag fired and the tag pushed through, there's the value. Field name client ID, here's the value of client ID. And at this point, we should see minimal users. Now I'm gonna have to actually time this out, I think, to do this. And to be honest, I don't know that real view is gonna be the best way of testing this one because there's so much processing on the back end that I think would stitch these together since we're overriding some stuff.
I guess with the actual same client IDs, it would be even visible in the real time. But because we've just done some testing.
Yeah, we'd have to wait for a few minutes here.
See it here. What we can do is that
you know what? It's because I've been looking at page views. That's why I was looking at 30-minute views. We need to be looking at active user views. And this did work. So let me show this to you. Okay, so here's how we're going to verify this. So I'm going to go back. So let's refresh this one more time. So I'm refreshing. We're gonna verify this by doing this. I'm gonna do a little test. This is a nice little trick with UTMs. So we're gonna do UTM source equals test and UTM medium equals test and UTM campaign equals test. So we're gonna do all three of those. This is gonna create a new session. So I'm gonna go into our analytics. I'm gonna go to our traffic sources in real time. We should see test, which is what I'm doing. Now I'm filtering just for test. I'm looking at content. So I should be seeing just me. So far, so good. I'm on the webinar page. So now when I do this and I click on register now, we just saw that in theory, this all worked, but we got to make sure that even though Tag Manager looks like it's throwing the ball, like did GA catch it, right? Did GA get the package delivered as expected? So what I should see is now that I've done this, when I go back into my real time, and this is really, we're testing two things. One is, did the client ID connect the dots the way it needed to? So I was just showing one user. And at the same time, is my traffic attribution working, right? So that now test would get credit for this. The only reason that'll happen is because test would be my traffic source. So what I should see is when I click back over to analytics, instead of seeing that I'm on the parent page, I should see that I'm on this GenD register box form. So let's see if that is the case. And look at that. test is getting credit for me going to the the Gendi register box page, which is perfect. So this is exactly what I wanted. And what's also interesting about this case, remember how we did the register box as lowercase? This is why, because I looked at this in analytics and that's how I set it up. But you don't do that. You want to set it up based on what tag manager sees, because that tag manager is in control. And that's why we had to do that capital B, because that's what tag manager
I guess
saw.
you have a filter to lower.
We probably, we might. But this was just a great use case of like, okay, always look at what tag manager's version of the truth is, because that's what matters. You may have thought you said it incorrectly, but in this case it wasn't. And this is great. So now when I register for the webinar and then I go into my thank you page, so let's say test, I'm going to minimize this so we have a room here. So test, and then test@test.com. We register for this. I should go to my thank you page. Now here, we didn't talk about this, but did this just work? Did it? Because this should be, this did not work. And the reason it didn't work is because I took off all the page views for Gendi pages. So now I need to fire a generic page view on my thank you page to get the whole thing kind of complete in this particular example. So if I go back to my tags, so we have
might
our...
as well just excludes the register box from all pages instead of, the GA page view mm.io pages is now firing a page view all mm.io pages. You might as well just put it on all pages and exclude the register box.
So we'll exclude, basically, we're going to set up another trigger that says at page view, some page views, when the page URL contains
register box.
Gendi.com/
I guess we already have that, haven't we?
I may have deleted it. So this is page views. Or sorry, page views, I should say. Page view, and then Gendi.com register box. So we've got register box, and then that is an exclusion now. So we're saying fire on all pages is what we can do now, except for these. So we're going to take this one out because it's still too restrictive. We're going to add in, back in, I should say, are all pages. Now we're saying, so this is just adjusting a trigger and making a more useful version, right? It was good enough to get going. Now we're going back and making it better. So now it's fire on all pages and then except for anything that's a register box, because we're taking care of that differently with our scripts and our listeners that we just set up. So now I can refresh this. And then what should happen is if I just refresh this page, which is a thank you page, I can refresh this page. And then let's see where we are. So if I go here, there's a thank you page. And what's interesting about this is if you notice, I didn't change this. I'm still in the same session. I just refreshed the page and now it fires a page view. And guess why it's showing as thank you and it's under test? It's because the client ID was set when we loaded the iframe. So now Gendi.com has the correct client ID. So if I come back and watch a replay 2 days from now, it's the right client ID. If I come back and watch the live event, it's the right client ID. Again, barring anybody changing those, because that happens too. People, erase cookies or whatever. But for the most part, those will remain intact and give us a useful truth as we track through our various webinars. So Ahmad, this is awesome. Thank you for this. I think this was kind of going back and refreshing. It is. It's such a great solution. Now, again, there are a lot of moving pieces. So we're gonna kind of cover these one at a time as we went through them. So the very first thing is we set up our basic page view tracking. What we did here, the only thing we really did differently is from a trigger perspective, and I'm going to put this in here because I think it's kind of useful. We said everything except register box. That's where we ended up. So everything except for that register box gets the page view tag. And that's because the register box stuff, we're doing separately another way. Okay. So the GA page view, this is on the parent. Then we have and that's just sort of the traditional page view tag doing its thing, everything except register box. Then the client ID is done with a custom JavaScript variable. Okay. So this is our custom JavaScript variable, and this grabs the client ID. Okay, which in our little example is ABC. Then what we did is we set up these listeners. We had 2 listeners that were basically the same. One, the listener scripts themselves actually are the same. So it's listen and then push, right? So listen and then push. So what happens is it listens and then pushes for information and pushes it into the data layer so that GTM sees the events, right? That's what it's for. So in this case, it listens for the iframe ready, which technically, let's go back to what we actually had this as. So in Tag Manager, we had our parent listener, which is listening. This is just the generic one, right? Listens for anything and pushes into the data layer. This was our listener for Gendy. And this actually was the same thing, listens for anything and then pushes in the data layer, but then also sends iframe needs client to the parent, which is what the parent's listening for ultimately. So that's our iframe needs client. So that goes back into here. So it's listening for this, for iframe needs client. Okay, so iframe needs client ID is what it's listening for here. Let's kind of minimize that. There we go. So listen, and then it pushes that. When it pushes that is when it triggers a script to send back the, technically, let's see, this is kind of what's happening. So it'll send another script to listen in this case, not to listen and push. This basically sends the client ID to the iframe. Okay, so it's sending it to the iframe. And in this case, when it sends that, it uses our custom JavaScript variable. Okay, so this is where basically it's doing this. It's saying pass this through. So this is our custom JavaScript client ID that we set up.
Yes.
And then that's this, right? Same thing. So that's what this is. So it's our custom JavaScript ID. So when it's doing that, so this gets pushed over here. This is how the client ID actually is pushed into the data layer is what this becomes. So let's change this and we'll say this is more of like a push this into the data layer. So we'll do like that. So this is the data layer. Okay, so now this is being pushed into the data layer on the iframe. So we'll say this is the iframe data layer. I don't actually know if it's capital F, small f, who knows? iframe data layer, there we go. So now this information gets pushed in the iframe data layer, and at that point, this is listening for this information. So it's going to grab the data layer value, and it's going to pass it through into GA with that one exception, which is our override. Okay, so this is going to be our little override. And this is where we push through our data layer variable of the client ID. And remember, we had to go a couple levels deep there to grab it, but that's what we did. So turn this one into green. So now this is all sort of consistent. So now we've got listen and push. And now what happens is, because this is in the data layer variable, that is what overrides our Google Analytics settings variable. That's there. And now everything goes proper green and all the dots are connected, and it fires the page view because of the event that comes through here. So when it gets in the data layer, there's an event that it pushes that client ID, and that basically is, what was it, received client ID, I think?
Yeah, received client ID camel case.
Pretty simple. So here, when the parent sends the client ID, it has received client ID right there. So that's how it's actually getting its information. And then, so again, data layer receives client, it listens for, pushes the client ID. In this case, it's going to listen and push for received client ID, which is the big thing there. So now you've got received client ID. And then when received client ID happens, it says, cool, go ahead, pass it through to Google Analytics. Oh, by the way, override the data layer variable, which of course is what pushed from here. So our data layer is pushing this information into the data layer. A little funky, but I think you get the idea. So that is how this works. Now, again, lots of moving pieces. This is one of those workshops that is definitely a little longer than the rest, but it covers a ton of stuff and is definitely beyond the basics. So if you're just starting out with cookies, if you're just starting out with custom JavaScript variables, like take it low and slow. Go through this. You'll see Ahmad. He's around. He's in the Winner Circle Facebook group, so you'll be able to see them there as well and ask questions. And of course, Ask an Instructor is always an option as well. But you can see lots of moving pieces, but this is one of the more complicated things, even though it seems really simple because it's a platform that everybody and their brother uses for webinars. It's not something that is a very easy thing to do out of the box because there's so many moving pieces, because the iframe is delayed. But now that you know this technique, like what else might you be able to use this for? Because this is something you may be able to use over and over again. So lots of cool stuff that you're able to learn and practice and put into fruition to actually help you track cross-domain tracking across WebinarJam and EverWebinar. So not as simple as just putting code on pages, but that is definitely the first step. Make sure the code's on pages and then make sure all of these different dots are connected. And of course, reach out to us to help out as well. So Ahmad, thank you for that. Hopefully they got at least one new thing. There was lots of new things I saw, like the delayed iframe, the idea of the parent and the child sort of listening back and forth, the parent and the iframe. Passing details back and forth, I think is great. That listener script with the idea of you can set something up to listen and then push the information in the data layer so that Tag Manager can get access to it with the data layer variable. Like there's lots of cool stuff in there. So thank you again, man, for spending the time and energy to walk us through all these moving pieces. It's fantastic. Is there anything else that you want to sort of add to wrap it up?
No, that's basically it. And you've just covered everything. Thank you for that.
Perfect. And again, where can they reach out to you, Ahmad, if they have a specific question? Obviously in the Winner Circle Facebook group, you're there.
Yeah, they can tag me in the Facebook group or they can email me if they have any questions. But, Facebook group would be, if the question is public and everyone can, benefit from the answer, they can just tag me in the Facebook group.
I love that.
I would be happy to answer any questions.
I love that. So thank you for that and for doing that. And of course, email is hello@siavak.com, SIAVAKE. Sorry, SIAVAK.com.
Yeah, only if you cannot share it publicly.
Only if you can't share it publicly. Perfect. So ideally share it publicly because we all can learn. And a lot of times it's those sharing it publicly. Somebody else is asking the same question, that you're asking. So be brave and definitely do that. So thank you again, man. For those, by the way, not yet a part of Measurement Marketing Academy, obviously encourage you to do that. Measure.tips/start will take you to all the fun details with this group coaching, obviously access to the Winner Circle, et cetera, et cetera. We are also having office hours. It's this Wednesday, 3:30 p.m. Eastern. So if you are already an Academy member, we look forward to seeing you there. Your link should have already been emailed out to you. So you have those and you can of course access those within the Academy as well. When you log in, go to Academy Office Hours and you'll see the link for this week's Office Hours member Q&A. So you can get all the details and maybe even ask some questions about this particular workshop or your setup and get some help as well. And that's it. We'll go ahead and wrap it up. So you've just watched Beyond the Basics, tracking webinars. In this case, WebinarJam and EverWebinar. They both work exactly the same way. They both have that setup. I only showed the WebinarJam one, but EverWebinar is identical. So follow through with that and happy cross-domain tracking. Coming up next week, I should say, strategy session, what and why, key numbers that you need to know specifically. Again, this is for our strategists. So if you're not the one that's doing the implementation back there, but you're more kind of like, okay, what numbers should I make sure are being measured and what actions do they actually lead to? That's what we'll be talking about on the next Workshop Wednesday. Speaking of, if you're not yet a part of Workshop Wednesday, currently it is free. So I'm dropping enough hints about that, hopefully that you are taking advantage of it while it is free. Measure.tips/WW will get you there. We don't make all of these public, but we offer a few here and there. But if you want access to all of them, you do get access to them. A new workshop each and every week at measure.tips/WW. All right, that is it. We'll go ahead and shut it down. Thanks again. You've just watched Beyond the Basics, tracking webinars. In this case, WebinarJam and EverWebinar. Appreciate you watching this workshop. We will see you on the next one. Take care.